The Montgomery Boycott by Coretta Scott King. Of all the facets of segregation in Montgomery, the most degrading were the rules of the Montgomery City bus lines. This Northern-owned corporation outdid the South itself. Although 70% of its passengers were black, it treated them like cattle. Worse than that, for nobody insults a cow. The first seats on all buses were reserved for whites. Even if they were unoccupied and the rear seats crowded, Negroes would have to stand at the back in case some whites might get aboard. And if the front seats happened to be occupied and more white people boarded the bus, black people seated in the rear were forced to get up and give them their seats. Furthermore, I don't think Northerners ever realized this. Negroes had to pay their fares at the front of the bus, get off, and walk to the rear door to board again. Sometimes the bus would drive off without them after they paid their fare. This would happen to elderly people or pregnant women in bad weather or good, and was considered a great joke by the drivers. Frequently, white bus drivers abused their passengers, called them niggers, black cows, or black apes. Imagine what this was like, for example, for a black man to get on a bus with his son and be subjected to such treatment. There had been one incident in March 1955 when 15-year-old Claudette Colvin refused to give up her seat to a white passenger. The high school girl was handcuffed and carted off to the police station. At that time, Martin served on a committee to protest to the city and to the bus company officials. The committee was received politely, and nothing was done. The fuel that finally made that slow-burning fire blaze up was an almost routine incident. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks, a 42-year-old seamstress whom my husband aptly described as a charming person with a radiant personality, boarded a bus to go home after a long day of working and shopping. The bus was crowded and Miss Parks found a seat at the beginning of the Negro section. At the next stop, more whites got on. The driver ordered Miss Parks to give her seat to a white man who boarded, and this meant that she would have to stand all the way home. Rosa Parks was not in a revolutionary frame of mind. She had not planned to do what she did. Her cup had run over. As she said later, I was just plain tired and my feet hurt. So she sat there, refusing to get up. The driver called a policeman who arrested her and took her to the courthouse. From there, Mrs. Parks called E.D. Nixon, who came down and signed a bail bond for her. Mr. Nixon was a fiery Alabamian. He was a Pullman porter who had been active in A. Philip Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and in civil rights activities. Suddenly, he also had had enough. Suddenly, it seemed, every Negro in Montgomery had had enough. It was spontaneous combustion. Phones ringing all over the Negro section of the city. The Women's Political Council suggested a one-day boycott of buses as a protest. E.D. Nixon courageously agreed to organize it. The first we knew about it was when Mr. Nixon called my husband early in the morning of Friday, December 2nd. He had already talked to Ralph Abernathy. After describing the incident, Mr. Nixon said, "We have taken this type of thing too long. I feel the time has come to boycott the buses. It's the only way to make the white folks see that we will not take this sort of thing any longer." Martin agreed with him and offered the Dexter Avenue Church as a meeting place. After much telephoning, a meeting of black ministers and civic leaders was arranged for that evening. Martin said later that as he approached his church Friday evening, he was nervously wondering how many leaders would really turn up. To his delight, Martin found over 40 people representing every segment of Negro life crowded in the large meeting room at Dexter. There were doctors, lawyers, businessmen, federal government employees, union leaders, and a great many ministers. The latter were particularly welcome not only because of their influence, but because it meant that they were beginning to accept Martin's view that religion deals with both heaven and earth. Any religion that professes to be concerned with the souls of men and is not concerned with the slums that doom them, the economic conditions that strangle them, and the social conditions that cripple them, is a dry-as-dust religion. From that very first step, the Christian ministry provided the leadership of our struggle, as Christian ideals were its source. Martin told me after he got home that the meeting was almost wrecked because questions or suggestions from the floor were cut off. However, after a stormy session, one thing was clear, however. Much they differed on the details, everyone unanimously for a boycott. It was set for Monday, December 5th. Committees were organized. All the ministers presented promised to urge their congregations to take part. Several thousand leaflets were printed on the church mimeograph machine, describing the reasons for the boycott and urging all Negroes not to ride buses to work, to town, to school, or any place on Monday, December 5th. Everyone was asked to come to a mass meeting at the Holt Street Baptist Church on Monday evening for further instructions. The Reverend A.W. Wilson had offered his church because it was larger than Dexter and more convenient being in the center of the Negro district. Saturday was a busy day for Martin and the other members of the committee. They hustled around town talking with other leaders, arranging with Negro-owned taxi companies for special bulk fares and with the owners of private automobiles to get people to and from work. I could do little to help because Yoki was only 2 weeks old, and my physician, Dr. W.D. Pettis, was very careful, advised me to stay in for a month. However, I was kept busy answering the telephone, which rang continuously, and coordinating from that central point the many messages and arrangements. Our greatest concern was how were we going to reach the 50,000 black people of Montgomery, no matter how hard we worked. The white press, in an outraged expose, spread the word for us in a way that would have been impossible with only our own resources. As it happened, a white woman found one of our leaflets, which her Negro maid had left in the kitchen. The irate woman immediately telephoned the newspapers to let the white community know what the blacks were up to. We laughed a lot about this, and Martin later said we owed them a great debt. On Sunday morning, from their pulpits, almost every Negro minister in town urged people to honor the boycott. Martin came home late Sunday night and began to read the morning paper. The long articles about the proposed boycott accused the NAACP of planting Miss Parks on the bus. She had been a volunteer secretary for the Montgomery chapter and likened the boycott to the tactics of the white citizens' councils. This upset Martin. That awesome conscience of his began to gnaw at him, and he wondered if he were doing the right thing. Alone in his study, he struggled with the question of whether the boycott method was basically unchristian. Certainly it could be used for unethical ends, but as he said, we were using it to give birth to freedom and to urge men to comply with the law of the land. Our concern was not to put the bus company out of business, but to put justice in business. He recalled Thoreau's words, "We can no longer lend our cooperation to an evil system," he thought, and he who accepts the evil without protesting it against is really cooperating with it. Later, Martin wrote, "From this moment on, I conceived of our movement as an act of massive non-cooperation. From then on, I rarely used the word boycott." Serene after his inner struggle, Martin joined me in our sitting room. We wanted to get to bed early, but Yoki began crying and the telephone kept ringing. Between interruptions, we sat together talking about the prospects for the protest. We were both filled with doubt. Attempted boycotts had failed in Montgomery and other cities. Because of changing times and tempers, this one seemed to have a better chance, but it was still a slender hope. We finally decided that if the boycott was 60% effective, we would be doing all right and we would be satisfied to have made a good start. A little after midnight, we finally went to bed, but at 5:30 the next morning, we were up and dressed again. The first bus was due at 6 o'clock at the bus stop just outside our house. We had coffee and toast in the kitchen. Then I went into the living room to watch. Right on time, the bus came, headlights blazing through the December darkness, all lit up inside. I shouted, "Martin, Martin, come quickly." He ran in and stood beside me, his face lit with excitement. There was not one person on that usually crowded bus.